Paul, a key figure in Christianity. Now, many of us know Paul as the guy who dramatically switched teams, from hunting down Christians to becoming one of their biggest champions. But here's the twist. Paul wasn't just a convert. Many scholars today actually see him as one of the founders of Christianity itself. So, let's dive into how this all unfolded. Paul, originally a Jew from the diaspora, was part of the Pharisees, a strict Jewish sect. One day, he had a life-changing experience. He believed he saw the resurrected Jesus. This moment turned his world upside down, and he spent the rest of his life spreading the news that Jesus would soon return to bring about God's kingdom. Paul wasn't trying to start a new religion. In fact, he thought the end of the world was right around the corner. But when things didn't happen as quickly as expected, early Christian leaders leaned on Paul's teachings to help shape what eventually became Christian doctrine. Now, Paul is often called Saul of Tarsus because, according to Luke, one of the writers of the New Testament, that's where he was born. Tarsus was in what is now Turkey. However, Paul himself mentioned that he was from near Damascus in Syria. This isn't the only time where Luke's account and Paul's own words don't quite match up. Luke paints Paul as someone closely tied to the early Jewish Christian leaders in Jerusalem. But Paul's own letters suggest he was more of a lone wolf, guided directly by his vision of Jesus rather than by the Jerusalem authorities. When it comes to Paul's actual writings, the New Testament traditionally credits him with 14 letters, but scholars agree that only 7 of those were really written by Paul himself. These include letters like 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and Romans. The other letters were likely penned by his followers, using Paul's name to give their words more weight. These letters weren't meant to lay down the law for Christianity. They were more like personal notes addressing specific issues in the communities Paul was guiding. But over time, they became key texts in shaping Christian beliefs. And now let's dive into Paul's famous conversion, an event that's been talked about for centuries and has even become a metaphor for sudden enlightenment. Now, before his big moment, Paul was a Pharisee, deeply committed to the Jewish law. He wasn't just any Pharisee, though. He was extremely zealous, claiming he knew the law of Moses better than anyone else. This is a guy who was really serious about his faith. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin, which might explain why some texts refer to him as Saul. That's a name with strong ties to his heritage. Name changes in the Bible often signify a shift in a person's mission or identity, like Abram becoming Abraham or Simon turning into Peter. So, when Paul encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus and was struck blind, it wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was the beginning of a complete transformation. But calling Paul a convert might not be entirely accurate. Why? Because at the time, there wasn't a fully formed Christian religion to convert to. Paul himself was a bit ambiguous about his identity. He once said, "When among the Gentiles, I acted as a Gentile, and when among the Jews, I acted as a Jew. I was all things to all men." This makes it tricky to pin down exactly how Paul saw himself. It might be more accurate to say that Paul felt called by God, much like the prophets of ancient Israel. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul describes how he received a vision of the resurrected Jesus, who commissioned him to be the apostle to the Gentiles. This was a big deal for Paul because he wasn't part of the original group of apostles. So he used this direct encounter with Jesus to validate his authority, putting him on equal footing with those who had actually walked with Jesus during his life. Paul's mission to the Gentiles was pretty shocking, especially because he openly admitted that he had once persecuted the early church. Now, what exactly does persecuted mean? The Greek word he used could mean anything from mocking to physical harm. Paul never gives us the full story on what he did or why. Luke, in the book of Acts, claims that Paul voted to execute Christians in the Sanhedrin and even got warrants to arrest Christians in Damascus. But this seems like an exaggeration, as the high priest didn't have that kind of power, especially outside his own province. It's likely that Paul was involved in what he himself experienced later, being punished with 39 lashes, a form of synagogue discipline. This raises another question. Why would Paul, who could have just walked away, choose to submit to such punishment? Maybe this suggests that he still considered himself a Jew, even after his encounter with Jesus. But what were the Christians doing to deserve such punishment? Some theories suggest they were teaching against the law of Moses, particularly to Gentiles, or that they were stirring up messianic fervor, which could have been seen as a threat to the peace, especially in the tense years leading up to the Jewish revolt. Another interesting point is Paul's high Christology, meaning he viewed Jesus as divine. After his vision of Jesus in heaven, Paul began advocating the worship of Jesus, a big turning point that started to separate Christians from mainstream Judaism. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul shares a hymn that speaks of Jesus being in the nature of God, yet humbling himself to become human and even accepting death on a cross. And because of this humility, God exalted Jesus, giving him a name above all names, so that, at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. This idea of worshiping Jesus was a significant departure from Jewish tradition, where worship was reserved for God alone. And now let's talk about his complex relationship with the law of Moses and how it shaped his mission. Paul saw his role as bringing the good news to the Gentiles, and much of what he wrote revolves around how the law applies or doesn't apply to them. You see, according to Jewish tradition, the law of Moses wasn't meant for Gentiles, so Paul argued that they didn't need to follow practices like circumcision, dietary restrictions, or Sabbath observance, which were all central to Jewish identity. These rituals, after all, were markers that kept Jewish and Gentile communities separate, and Paul was determined to break down those barriers. But here's the thing, Paul was a Pharisee, someone who had a deep respect for the law. So, he was walking a fine line. On one hand, he believed that Gentiles shouldn't be bound by these laws. On the other, he couldn't outright dismiss the law's importance. This tension led Paul into some pretty tricky theological territory, and scholars have been debating his views for centuries. One of the best examples of Paul wrestling with this issue is in his letter to the Galatians. Paul had set up communities in places like Galatia, now modern-day Turkey, only to find out later that others had come in after him, teaching a different message, one that insisted Gentiles needed to follow Jewish laws like circumcision. Paul was furious. To him, there was no other gospel but the one he preached, and he made it clear that even if an angel from heaven delivered a different message, it would still be wrong. To back up his stance, Paul looked to the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. He argued that God's original covenant with Abraham included all nations, meaning the Gentiles too. The law of Moses, Paul said, came later as a kind of tutor or guide to help people understand what sin is. But now that Christ had come, the law had reached its goal, or telos. Some translations call this the end of the law, but it's more accurate to say that Christ was the law's fulfillment. This didn't mean that Jewish Christians were off the hook when it came to following the law. If you were born under the law, you were still expected to live by it. Over time, Paul's teachings have often been oversimplified as promoting a law-free gospel for the Gentiles. But that's not entirely true. Paul wasn't advocating for total freedom from the law. He was against specific practices like circumcision and dietary restrictions. He still expected his Gentile followers to abandon idolatry and adopt Jewish ethical and moral teachings. Now, one of Paul's key phrases, saved by faith alone, not by works of the law, became a cornerstone for many interpretations, especially during the Reformation. But what Paul meant by works of the law were those ritualistic practices that created divisions between communities, not good deeds or moral behavior in general. His real battle wasn't against Judaism as a whole, but against the idea that Gentiles had to become Jews before they could become Christians. Ironically, it seems that some of those pushing for circumcision were Gentile Christians themselves, possibly out of a fear that by not following Jewish customs, they were delaying the return of Jesus. Paul, however, wasn't as worried about the timing of the end times. He believed that the Gentiles turning to the God of Israel was a sign that the final days were near, and his mission was to reach as many Gentiles as possible. Once that happened, he believed, the Jewish people would also come to see the truth, and God's kingdom would be complete. As for Paul's death, we don't have a clear record of where or how it happened. His letter to the Romans is likely one of his last, where he talks about his plans to visit Jerusalem and then head to Rome, with hopes of continuing on to Spain. According to the book of Acts, Paul was arrested in Jerusalem and, as a Roman citizen, appealed to have his case heard by the emperor in Rome. The story ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, still preaching. Later legends, written in the 2nd century, tell of Paul's trial in Rome, where he was supposedly beheaded and buried outside the city to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. Today, the Basilica of Paul's outside the walls in Rome is believed to be the site of his burial. Paul's legacy is a complex one, marked by his efforts to bridge the gap between Jewish and Gentile believers and to spread a message that would eventually lay the foundations for Christianity as a global religion.